my dad was traveling in Kansas City and he was hospitalized. It was an emergency. I get a phone call and my dad says to me, Peter, I've got bad news and I've got good news. And I had no idea what was going on, what kind of bad news and what kind of good news was coming from the old man. Well, as it turns out, he and my mother had been scheduled to go to Washington, D.C. and to be honored by President and Mrs. Reagan at the White House. They had founded a scholarship program and were going to receive the President's Volunteer Action Award, one of 18 recipients across the country. It was a very big deal. And so my dad calls me on the phone. He says, well, the bad news is I don't get to go to the White House. The good news is you do. And at that point, I sort of had mixed feelings about my father's health, I've got to tell you. And all of a sudden, I find myself, I'm 26 years old, and I'm at the White House. And I'm seated at a luncheon, and I'm 2 seats away from the First Lady, from Nancy Reagan. And during the course of this conversation, you can imagine the wow factor that's underway here. I had determined to do something, and I had no idea what it was, something special that day. And I was just thinking about it, trying to come up with something. You know, my dad's in the hospital, and what am I going to do to try and make this a special day for him? So I said to the First Lady, I explained to her that I wasn't the award winner. My father was in the hospital, and it would mean the world to him if the President would give him a call. And I said further, that the reason my mother wasn't here today was because she was standing by her man. I know, I wasn't playing fair. I used those exact words with Nancy Reagan. She looked at me and she said, what's the number? I handed her the phone number, walked away, had no idea, you know, great lunch the rest of the day, and had no idea what was going to happen. That night, my dad is in the hospital in Kansas City. The phone rings. It's a male operator, and he says, is this Mr. Roskam? Yes, my dad replies. Is this Verlin Roskam? Yes. Please hold. The next voice you hear is the President of the United States. To which my father replies, right. This must happen to this White House operator all the time. So he prevails on my father. And the next voice is President Ronald Reagan. President Reagan comes on the phone, spends a couple minutes with my dad. If you knew my dad, my father then says, hey, Mr. President, do you have a minute to say hi to my wife? He cups the phone, whistles at my mother, who's down at the nurse's station, who comes in, Mr. President. That was a great moment, wasn't it? There were no cameras, no press releases, nothing. It was Ronald Reagan taking a tiny moment and turning it into a great moment in our family's life. I want to talk about 2 episodes in our history that I have characterized not as tiny moments, but as tipping points. And this idea comes from 2 presidents that came from Illinois. Now, I'm from Illinois, and that's a complicated place these days, but let's face it, we brought you Ronald Reagan, and we brought you Abraham Lincoln, and 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Story. Ronald Reagan goes to Iceland. He is prompted there by an invitation, essentially by Mikhail Gorbachev. And the invitation is, Mr. President, you and I can eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons, and we can make history. I'm sure the conversation may have gone like we can actually earn a Nobel Prize, and we can move forward together, and off we go. There's just one little thing, Mr. President. The only thing I need you to do is to agree to eliminate the Strategic Defense Initiative. Just one tiny little thing. It's not a big deal. It's just in the laboratory, and you know this story. President Reagan says no. Ronald Reagan saw that that was a tipping point. Ronald Reagan recognized the strength of the United States, the strength of the West, the strength of freedom and truth and ascendant movements, and he stared him down, and what happened? He triumphed. We all triumphed. Now millions of Americans call themselves free. Millions of people around the world call themselves free because one person recognized a tipping point in history. Second story. Abraham Lincoln. wins the election in 1860, he is sworn into office, and within a very short period of time, states start to secede. They start moving away. And they say, if you're president of the United States, we're out. We are going to leave the Union. And can you imagine what the voices would have been like among Lincoln's advisors that would have said, just let him go. Let him go. You don't want to do it. Just let him go. It's not worth the fight. What did Abraham Lincoln do? He recognized that this was a tipping point in history. He recognized that there were things that were worth fighting for, and God bless Abraham Lincoln for preserving a union. And from 1860 on, and from years before, there is no question that the United States of America has been a force for good. But it was Abraham Lincoln that recognized that tipping point in history. Friends, we're at a tipping point right now. We're at a time of real, fundamental choosing about the direction that we're going as a nation. Paul Johnson, great British historian, no stranger to this group, wrote a book, A History of the American People. And in that book, Johnson talks about our founders. And he says that these people, the cast of characters that put our nation together, the A-Team, all these names that we know, and we have monuments in this town to these names, one after another, unbelievable talent. Washington and Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton and you name them. He compares that group to the advisors of King George III, and I love this image. He says the difference between the American founders and the advisors of King George III were as deep as the Atlantic that separated them. Now, that is our heritage. That is the gift that we have been entrusted with. Colleen mentioned a minute ago this notion of Isaac and Jacob. How we move forward in this environment, recognizing this. You know this story. Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau is the oldest son who gets the lion's share of the old man's interest. He comes in from the field. His younger brother is cooking stew. And he says, give me some stew. And younger brother Jacob says, give me your birthright. And Esau, like a fool, says, okay. In fact, as the Bible tells the story, Esau uses this ridiculous logic. He says, I'm starving to death. What good is the birthright if I starve to death? I will give it to you in exchange for a pot of stew. That is exactly what the American left is coaxing the public into today. It is saying, just give us your birthright as Americans. Give it up. And in exchange, we'll give you stability. Well, heaven help us if we make that deal. Heaven help us if we're complicit in that deal. And I just say this. We have an unbelievable opportunity, you and I, to recognize that this is a tipping point. This is a time when we claim our heritage as Americans. This is a time where we recognize that we're the only country in the world where people are jumping fences and swimming across rivers and climbing under walls and building tunnels to get here. And yet none of us were present at the founding of this nation, lest we become arrogant in this. We're not arrogant. There's no hubris. There's no triumphalism. There's no sense of any of that. But ultimately, we have a quiet confidence. We have a quiet confidence that America is exceptional. There are some voices out there that say, well, even your claims of exceptionalism aren't very exceptional.
That was a weird comment.
That's nonsense. So here we are. We're here at a season. We are here at a tipping point. We are here now, ready to do the things that are faithful to that heritage, ready to do the things that claim that birthright, and ready to do the things that make us a prosperous nation once again. Thank you very much.